Dan, I saw you recently published a piece calling for the creation of an FFRDC, or for those who don't know, a federally funded research and development center that could support diplomatic assessments for the State Department. Um, it, I think it's a really interesting. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about why you're making that recommendation. I've been involved in some work at Carnegie on a very different set of issues where we also came up with almost the exact same recommendation that we need to create new FFRDCs or FFRDC-like organizations. These are places like RAND or IDA or the Center for Naval Analyses that are very respected government-linked research organizations that were established in the mid-20th century and are seen as highly successful. What do you think it is about these organizations that made them so successful? And why is it that so many of us today, looking at different policy problems, are finding ourselves yearning for more FFRDCs? What does that tell us about the state of things and the kind of conditions that might be needed for an organization like that?
I've heard policymakers talk about that when they go into government, particularly political appointees, when they go into government, it's a time to expend the intellectual capital that they've already collected, rather than a time and a place to build new intellectual capital. So as we go in this fast-moving, rapidly changing world that we're in today, as we go into new spaces, confront new challenges, quantum computing, cybersecurity, cyber deterrence, lots of things, yeah, and technology, exclamation point, then we're looking for people to help us. We want to understand not just what's an explanation of what a blockchain is, but how do I create policy to regulate this new instrument that I don't understand? Those types of questions require real collaboration between the decision maker and researchers and back-end support. This isn't quite what the Intel community does usually, though in some places it sometimes I think so. But rather wanting somebody to really sit, pour through the record, spend 6 months, bring together disparate sources of knowledge in multidisciplinary ways in a way that really connects to the levers that the policymaker can pull. Not just to say, yeah, okay, we get it. Blockchain is really important, or quantum computing is going to be really important. But okay, but what do I do about it? What are the levers that I can pull? And how is it going to work likely if I pull this lever, if I try to go bilaterally versus multilaterally, if I try to put sanctions on this issue versus we bring it into government and we go big on blockchain ourselves. So I think that those questions in a fast-moving world need real analysis to support policymaker decision-making.
Has anyone proposed the West Point for foreign service officers?
Working on that now. That you'll stay tuned.
Seriously?
Yeah, we right. So just a quick review on the FFRDC piece. The Department of Defense has 10 FFRDCs. Foreign policy, writ large, this includes USAID and State Department and the National Security Council, have 0. So there's just not sources that of researchers with access to policymakers and access to classified information who are studying these issues. Very similar situation in the training and research space from a university perspective. I've spent a good years at the Foreign Service Institute where diplomats are trained. I learned to speak the wonderful language of Lithuanian there and took maybe about 3 months of consular training and general skill building before I became a diplomat. The average military officer, John, you were talking about military training before, sure haven't totally cracked that nut, but the average general today I read spends about a third of their career in training. Not deployed, but in training. Wow. The average State Department, maybe 5%. And the hard skills training, how do we conduct negotiations? How do we practice conducting negotiations? How do we think about deploying a sanction regime in a real time, in a fast-paced environment to create real challenging spaces for people to learn from people who are studying these questions just don't exist for foreign policy decision makers. So perhaps the State Department should have something like a war college or to upgrade the Foreign Service Institute with a real curriculum that would teach kind of core decision-making analytical methods, and then get into the weeds on some of these more specific issue areas. I think that'd be really exciting and really helpful. It's something that a lot of other countries have.
It's interesting that, it's not uncommon for folks in other parts of the national security establishment to actually spend some time at DoD educational institution, just because that's what's there in some sense. But yeah, Dan, I mean, it brings to mind a couple perennial challenges that I know DoD has struggled with in military education, which is, on the one hand, distinguishing between training and education, right? Training meaning learning a task that you can perform kind of by rote through a set of rules and conditions, versus what we might think of as education, which is, critical thinking skills, learning how to do things that you haven't done before, maybe no one has done before. And is it even possible to have a military education institution that can do that in the same way that the civilian world can?
The key point is that every diplomat thinks that absolutely everything they do is only education relevant, not training relevant. But in fact, what Dan is trying to do is make the point that no, we are doing things over and over and over again. And, there is an aspect of this, where you can have a little bit more of a checklist. And there are regressionable parts of this job in the way the U.S. engages with the world.
Yeah, I think that's a good division. And, this is the type of expertise when I speak with somebody like you, John, who's been in the thick of it from a different institution, where I say, gosh, I would love for this debate to play out at the Department of State. I just don't know if it's happening right now there. And, that's why FB21 exists, to have these conversations and to try to learn best practices and push the field forward. This is what we want. We want to advance. We want to innovate. We want to get better and smarter at our jobs to make a more peaceful world, to accomplish our U.S. national security objectives.
When I was in the IIC, there was a certain amount of training focused on critical analysis. And, we learned things like structured analytic techniques, right? How to do hypothesis testing, team A, team B, what if scenarios, right? Then on the other hand, when I went to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and was actually staffing memos for decision, there was nothing like that. There was no template. One of the things I loved about your report, Dan, is you have a model action officer action memo to the Secretary of State, where you actually have fields in there where a diplomat would have to say things like, what is the goal? What is the theory of change? Assign probabilities, risks, explain all of that. If you actually go and look at the official DoD action memo template, it just says, state the bottom line up front, put in relevant information. Exactly. It's kind of...
That's right on. Yeah, this is something we're really excited about. People ask me, if you could do one thing at the Department of State or the NSC, have one of your recommendations adopted, what would it be? This is it. I would say, as a starting point, let's just upgrade the memo. The lowly, humble memo. Let's just make it a little bit more juicy. Ask for, I think you said it all right, John, ask for the source of your analysis. Cite your sources. Let's have a space within that memo to give policymakers some insight on where this idea came from. What are some of the alternatives? State your goals clearly. This is one of my favorite parts. Break your goal down into its causal components, into the mechanisms. Okay, we want to democratize Cuba. So we're doing this new policy. It's called Democracy Cuba, and we're gonna do these radio station something. Okay, great. That's like a nice fairy tale, a nice story you just told me. Walk me through the steps that we're going to see if this policy is working. Tell me how we're going to monitor how this policy is working within the memo itself. First, we're going to do this. Then 1,000 people are going to fall in love with our radio ads and want to take action. And we think 10% of them are going to run for office. And we're going to support them when they do. That gives you... there's one of my favorite lines about diplomacy is that diplomacy is the art of telling somebody to go to hell and have them say thank you. That same rhetorical talent, I think, is often kind of bleeds into goal setting itself of making claims that can't be disproven. If you can't disprove the goal of the memo, we're going to push back against Russia. We're going to democratize Cuba. If it's kind of ambiguous, if it sounds right, if it feels right, but it's too ambiguous to actually measure, it's probably a really bad goal. It's probably not going to be something we're going to accomplish. And that policy memo is probably going to initiate a procedure which is going to live forever, and no one's going to be able to kill it because nobody's ever discussed what failure looks like up front. So if we create a different structure, a different process, we can start to reshape the way that we engage in the policy process itself.